Bob Zaino is an ecologist who revels in exploring the natural world. As a scientist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, he works to understand the patterns and distributions of natural communities and the myriad species they comprise. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. So I'm joined by three others who also, I think, revel in the natural world and understanding the pieces and processes and patterns. I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and I'm in what we sort of informally call the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory. And natural heritage programs are found throughout the U.S. I think every state has a natural heritage program, as well as the Canadian provinces and a good chunk of countries in Central America. Natural heritage programs working in their own jurisdictions and then collectively through the organization NatureServe are the organizations that track biodiversity, tracking rare plants and animals and significant ecological communities. And that may not sound so dramatic in now when we have things like eBird and iNaturalist, but natural heritage programs have been doing this for 40 or 50 years, collecting information about which species are rare, where are they found, where are they mapped, and then using that data for conservation. So it's a natural fit for natural heritage programs who are working on ecological communities, natural communities, to think about good condition examples of natural communities, and that leads right to old forests and old growth. And so the four of us, Marianne from Pennsylvania, Andy from New York, and Kristen from Maine, we're all going to talk about how our respective natural heritage programs address questions related to old forest definitions, inventory, and conservation. And so we're going to do a little bit of a whirlwind four talks here. And to get this going and not waste any more time, I'm going to hand it over to Marianne.
Are you the timekeeper?
I can do that,
Right.
I guess.
Right. Otherwise, I will talk over. All right. All right. Hi, my name's Marianne Furedi. I'm the assessment manager and an ecologist with the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. I work for Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, but Western Pennsylvania Conservancy is within the partnership of Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. Forgive me if you've seen these slides, some of these slides yesterday. I believe in recycling, especially talks. So, all right, so Bob asked us to address a couple different questions. So here, I have simply put what question I am addressing here. So for Pennsylvania's definition of old growth forest, yeah, that's a good question. And it's something that we are still contemplating. We've been working on a study the last couple of years to look at it. And I will say that I have funded in bold for a good reason, because that is often why we focus our energies on specific topics, is that we have the money to devote to looking at things. So in Pennsylvania, we're still working on crafting that, but hopefully the work we've been doing over the last couple years will contribute to that. It's definitely contributing to the larger understanding of what old growth means to Pennsylvania. And I think that's really something that's important too, is that we understand that old growth can be very regional. So, and that definition can be very regional. All right, so how do we find old growth forest in our state? We do know of several areas where historically old growth has been documented. There's been studies done, and that information is really valuable. It's also looking at the historical context and really like delving in and doing some research and looking at all of those old documents, county reports, records like those state records of big trees, like those are very interesting to look at. Local forester knowledge is really interesting and important too. There's just a lot of knowledge gained from being on the landscape your whole life. Also using aerial interpretation. The results of our old growth assessment right now is that we're still looking, we're still finding old growth sites. Old Growth Network, we've gotten a lot of information from them. And then our DCNR Bureau of Forestry is also using LIDAR, so using some of these aerial imagery and newer techniques to find our forests. All right, here we go. Oh, see, that happened. All right, so how does my program influence conservation and management? We happen to be well situated where we are because in Pennsylvania, the Heritage Program is a partnership. So it's the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, Bureau of State Forests, Bureau of State Parks, Fish and Boat, Game Commission, and Fish and Wildlife. So the information that we're working is actually a shared pool of information. So that enables us to really take our conservation information and translate it into management. Our data also provides evidence of just the biological diversity. I'm lucky to have coworkers that represent many different taxonomic expertise. So when we're out in an old growth forest, we're just not looking at trees. We're listening to the birds. We're looking at mosses. We're looking at mushrooms. It's really cool to just be able to learn a lot from just like hanging out with your coworkers. We're also mentioning this RAM, that's our rapid assessment, and the outcomes of just understanding the characteristics of old growth. We hope to use that to guide management objectives in the future. And then one question was picking out the favorite sites, old growth sites in our site. So I kind of wanted to do this like a Yelp review. So I asked the ecologists who've been working on this project to give me some of their thoughts. So Cook Forest, you heard a lot about Cook Forest today, and this happens to be one of Noah's sites. He said, it would be a lie. And so Noah has a very thick Southern accent too, so if I were saying it in Noah's voice, but it would be a lie if I didn't say that my favorite site in PA is Cook Forest. All the old growth characters are on full display there, and we certainly heard that in some of our plenary talks today. So Ephraim Zimmerman, his two favorites are Hill State Park, even though it was small, and then there was another site that was actually really cool. Greenwood Cemetery had a lot of old growth, and so, we think about cemeteries can be great sources for many different things, so including old growth. And he liked them because it was really unexpected. And then Claire, who's also attending this conference today, she really liked Otter Creek. She thought it was so different than most of our hemlock-dominated old growth. And the tree in the photo behind her was almost 400 years old. So it's cool to just be surrounded by old stuff, besides me. Sorry. All right, I'll leave it with that. All right, you're next.
All right, how's it going, everybody? Oh, there we go, a little lag on there. So I'm Andy, I'm the new ecologist for the New York Natural Heritage Program. I've only been here a few months, so still getting my feet under me, so please bear with me. All right, so what's nice about being in New York is we actually have a state definition for old growth. Sorry to inundate you all with legalese on this afternoon, but really it's about late successional tree species, achieving more of their maturity later, 180 to 200 years old, and also the multiple canopy strata, so not just an even-aged forest. And then, of course, pit and mount topography on the forest floor, coarse down wood, and distinct soil horizons. Of course, among other things I did not bold here. And, of course, the Heritage Program, we have a slightly different definition, which mostly follows the legal definition, which now, after some of the talks and discussions earlier, realized that might not fully encompass the range of conditions of old growth forests. But for the heritage program, we do allow forests that have been minimally harvested in the past, so perhaps some high grading of some of the conifers, which maybe there's just very few signs of that harvesting because it happened a long time ago. But no obvious human disturbance and self-perpetuating. So the idea that these forests in that condition and that composition can regenerate through time. And so we do have kind of two different concepts of what could be considered old growth, though. So one is this conventional description, really based off of, structure, in which some human disturbance is okay. So following that legal definition from New York or the Heritage Program, but really based off structure, where you have this cathedral-like forest with multiple canopy layers dominated by late successional trees and an abundance of coarse downed wood. And then conversations with other people, such as Michael Kudish, who's a guru on this stuff. He likes to use the term first growth, which is a little bit more lax in terms of the structure of the forest and really based off of a lack of human disturbance. And I think this has kind of come up repeatedly throughout the past few days. And so this is really more focused on land use history. So has this ever been come in and really appreciably altered by humans? And this is important because in Five Ponds Wilderness area, there's a very large tract of land that basically was following the New York State definition of an old growth forest, but then a natural disturbance, so a microburst went and leveled, I think it's like 50,000 acres. And so, of course, that's a stand replacing disturbance, right? So then you get an even-aged forest with probably lots of earlier successional trees coming in, which wouldn't really align with that, strict New York definition of old growth. So I still think there's a lot to resolve here, according to the panel, which I did not attend yesterday, that there's really no consensus. For the ecology program here at the Heritage Program, so really for our core kind of bread and butter work, we like to track the occurrences of old growth forests through our EO methods, or elemental occurrence. So that is when you see a significant natural community, we like to track their condition and then map them. And so it's really documenting their occurrences, using field data to characterize them as well, and then map their extent, so that way we know where they are. And whenever possible, using the biotics, which I'm still not really trained on doing, among the rest of the heritage people, we like to keep old growth occurrences separate from even similar communities that have been logged in the past. It's really interesting though, and makes me excited to be in New York, is that there's at least 300,000 acres of old growth forest, possibly more, depending on who you ask. And this is, of course, mostly in the forest preserve, so the Adirondack or the Catskill parks. And we also have a separate old growth forest project, which is funded directly through the Department of Environmental Conservation, only taking place in the Adirondacks and Catskills, because that's where most of the old growth forest is. And this is really tracking and measuring old growth forest characteristics, modeling and mapping their distribution across the landscape, and then estimating carbon storage, which is really important as New York is trying to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And it's becoming really emergent that these old growth forests are really critical carbon sinks. And so here's an example of some predicted old growth forests done by, I think it was Tim and our spatial ecologist. So all the areas in green here, and this is the Catskill Park work. So all these areas in green here are all predicted old growth forests. So a pretty sizable proportion of the landscape there.
This is future predicted.
This is predicted existing old growth forest. And so when determining new occurrences of old growth forests, we have the old growth rapid evaluation, partially designed by my predecessor Max, who I replaced just a few months ago. Short for ogre, not that kind of ogre. I don't know if anyone's seen Time Bandits, but I just rewatched it, and it's a very funny movie, and that's kind of old. So this is the idea of being able to go to an area where perhaps you have a lead, or you're out doing some work, doing some other project, and thought there's the potential that this is in fact an old growth forest. And so it's a way to get in and within just a few hours, go and kind of capture some of the main indicators that this could in fact be an old growth forest. And so it's just a plot list. I believe it's prism plots, although I've not done this, so please don't ask me on the details. just to kind of get the extent and condition of this potential old growth forest patch. However, this is really biased towards different variants of northern hardwood forests, and of course there's many other forest types such as mountain spruce fir forests in higher elevations in New York. So it doesn't really work for that, but that's something that we might tackle, in the future. But we do have a suite of indicators. I think these are pretty common amongst the rest of the heritage programs, but of course large late successional trees, pit and mound topography indicating that this was never cleared and turned into a farm field or logged so repeatedly that those pits and mounds kind of went away. Just lack of clear human disturbance such as roads, of course epiphytes, and of course woody debris, of course, too. And so just to kind of give you some visuals, so large trees, so right over there is a very large eastern white pine that's exactly breast height in diameter, 137 centimeters. Thought that was kind of neat. And there's a really large yellow birch from Five Ponds Wilderness area. And so it's got this curved bowl and then just few upper branches kind of looking contorted and platy bark. And if I remember, that tree was like 70 centimeters or more in diameter. So a very large old yellow birch tree. So always a good sign that you're in an old growth forest. Of course, the multiple canopy strata. So this is near Giant Ledge in the Catskills. So there's a very large canopy emergent red spruce there. And then, of course, younger age classes of trees filling in gaps where trees may have died and opened up resources. And here's an Allegheny State Park with a very large hemlock and younger trees over there. Of course, the epiphytes such as Lobaria pulmonaria, or just lungwort lichen, an important indicator, but most often found on maple or sometimes ash. So you won't find that in conifers as far as I know, at least in this part of the country. A Perella platyphilus, that's a leafy liverwort, and then Necra pinnata. And there's also some anomodon of some species there too, which may be a useful indicator as well. Of course, coarse downed wood or coarse woody debris, whatever you call it, is really important, especially if it's coming from late successional trees, indicating that these trees have existed in this forest has existed in its state, and where trees are achieving their maturity and their kind of the extent of their longevity and dying and being replaced uninterrupted by human activity. And so there's a tip-up mound, of course, and that's where the pit and mound topography comes from. That said, not unlike the other states here and things that have been touched on, but there are many threats to New York old growth, and I'm only going to list a few of them for time. So just diseases and pests. I'm not really going to talk about deer, but they're definitely important, especially in more fragmented landscapes. Of course, white pine needle disease, that's kind of a newer one, in which basically the needles fall off the white pines like in May, and then they kind of can barely keep up with the loss of needles. Beech bark disease, which has been around for a very long time now. And the newer one, beech leaf disease, which might just wipe the beech out at this point. It's really heartbreaking. And then hemlock woolly adelgid, also another heartbreaking disease. And who knows what else will come into New York and threaten the old growth. So there's spotted lanternfly, Asian longhorn beetle, some novel fungal pathogens. Who knows what might emerge in the upcoming years. And this might interact with exogenous factors, so beyond just what's happening locally across New York or in these forests. So of course, temperatures are rising, and so this could be stressing trees out in these old growth forests just from altering the climate regimes they've evolved with. Of course, there's long legacies of atmospheric deposition, including acid, sulfur, and also nitrogen. So that's also especially affected red spruce at higher elevations in the Adirondacks. And I think we get most of that before all that goes to New England, so you're welcome. And then, of course, drought stress. It's been incredibly dry this year. So, all these factors might interact, weaken trees, and then make them more susceptible to other pests. So who knows as we move forward. One thing that's more kind of unique to New York, as far as I know, is actually recreational threats. And this is especially in the Catskill high peaks. So these are mountains over 3,500 feet in elevation, which they are considered to be at the top's old or first growth, depending on the term you want to use, just because these trees are inaccessible and often shorter in stature and not valuable for timber, so they weren't cut largely. but 17 of the 35 peaks are actually trailless. So they don't have any designated trails set up by the DEC up to the tops. And of course, here they are. But there's been a recent increase in hikers, especially from COVID, and also like social media and Instagram, where people want to take pictures and look really cool on the top of these mountains there. And so it's really affecting and trampling understory vegetation. So you can see here, this was all like probably moss, and I think these are balsam fir seedlings right here. And it's just been denuded. Could be stressing out fine roots on the trees too, just from trampling. Sometimes affecting hydrology too, where a trail might form and then it rains and scours all the soil away. So here's another one there. So just lots of barren ground where it should be vegetated. And right there, it's just really bad. And someone even stacked some rocks to maybe have a seat and have lunch or something. So it's really an important disturbance, and we're still in the process of trying to determine like how big of an effect this is on some of these areas and kind of what to do about it. So is it a problem elsewhere? Okay, yeah, I figured. So for management, try to get through so I don't take up everyone's time here. So we really just want to know where the old growth forests are so they don't get cut or developed in some way. They've managed to go through all these legacies of logging and human land use. We want to keep them there as long as we can. It's important just for conservation, and we don't fully understand the biological diversity and value of these forests. Especially I have a mycology background, so I'm always curious about fungi in these forests. And so we just got to keep them there. If you don't know what you're missing, if it goes away before you can study it, right? Also important is understanding carbon storage, and again, it's emerging that these old growth forests are really important carbon sinks, and the trees accumulate biomass at a high rate even when they're getting really old. So it's really important to maintain them. And so here's just a map of increased carbon sequestration from the past, well, it's getting a little old, but basically past 30 years. In these areas in the darker blue are more carbon accumulation in that period, and lots of that are in the Catskill and Adirondack parks, which is where most of our old growth forests are. And so again, this is to meet our goals of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So of course, they are a critical carbon sink. Oh, sorry, I just jumped ahead. Thanks.
In case you couldn't tell, we are moving south to north.
Moving towards best.
No judgments. In Vermont, we, like a lot of the programs, of course, we classify, map, and track high-quality natural communities, and including old forests. I'm going to talk about that. We've been doing a lot of conservation science and planning, and I want to mention that. And we also do, I won't really talk about this so much, but we do a good bit of technical assistance, outreach, and education related to the data that we collect, both about old forests and about rare species and significant natural communities in general. Our definition of old forest in Vermont is based on a combination of structure and age, but I think the key piece is that it's very qualitative and it's very fuzzy. And actually going to a site and trying to evaluate it basically brings in all of the issues that were talked about in the definitions discussion yesterday. But I think in general, places that have trees that are at that half of their maximum lifespan, when you start to find trees that are 150 to 200 years old, is something we use as a good indicator. Also, if we know that there's a long history of minimal disturbance, so that continuity of process piece. So what that means is when we're out doing our assessments, we don't have any ogres in Vermont. We don't have like a standardized process we've been using. It's very qualitative, and we really are looking at the natural community types and then looking at the potential for them to be considered old relative to their natural community type. And I should say in Vermont, we don't even talk about old growth. Maybe we have it, maybe we don't, who knows what it is. But we can talk about old forests because those are at least something we can kind of wrap our minds around. Not worrying so much about has there been past human disturbance, but thinking about where there are places that are old that have had minimal disturbance. All the heritage programs use the biotics database. I think, Andy, you just mentioned it. It's a standardized system for tracking ecological data. And each state has the opportunity to add their own fields to this database. So we created our own field that is old forest. Yes, no, maybe, needs more info. And we have now just about 70 records of places that have been mapped as old forest natural communities. So is Bob Leverett here? Because yesterday he said we only have 5. But I think we've gone quite a bit beyond that, which is exciting. And we have another 153 sites that are maybes and need more inventory. One of the things that's really interesting to me is, as we've started to do this, we've started tracking even very small occurrences of old forest. And one of them is just 2 miles outside of our capital city of Montpelier, a little patch of old forest that's been known for years. Foresters from the Vermont Land Trust, I think, first identified it, but it's just this little 9-acre patch of 200 and 300-year-old hemlocks in a town forest. And just an example of how we can find these little patches in surprising places. Another site that I found during inventory recently is maybe not an old forest, but it's definitely a nearly old forest example of one of our rare natural communities, a mesic pine oak sandplain forest, which is sort of Vermont's not quite pine barrens natural community, but sandy flat soils and oak and pine, which in Vermont is very rare. And so these are the places where people put houses in Vermont. And so if you look at this community, you can see that it's in a landscape that's highly fragmented. And we've lost most of our sandplains. So to have one that is maybe nearly old forest is a really significant find and exciting. I've also got to plug an example of our old forests, the one that I'm leading a field trip to tomorrow. Near Silver Lake, 70 acres of old hemlock northern hardwood forest. It's been thoroughly researched by Charlie Cogbill and others, and just one of our better landscape examples of old forest. Our work on conservation planning, we've got this overall framework, Vermont Conservation Design, which has old and young forest targets. So we're thinking about finding examples of old forest, but also restoring old forest. We've got these acreage goals for different regions of the state. But I think one of the things is that we don't have a lot of future old forest in some parts of the state. And if we look at our goals in the light green versus where we have future old forest in dark green, there's a long way to go, particularly in places that are not the mountains. And what that means is that our ecological representation of future old forests and existing old forests is really biased towards those high elevation communities. Those are the places that are left alone, whether to not be harvested in the past or to not be harvested in the future. And I think trying to increase our representation and our inventory, looking for things like those old sandplain forests or other examples of natural communities, is really the future of our work with old forests, existing old forests, and our future old forests. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Maine.
Thanks. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Puryear. Can you hear me? Am I on the mic here? I'm Chief Ecologist with the Maine Natural Areas Program. We are in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry in Maine. Each of the heritage programs is housed in something different, just to keep things exciting. So here's just our general overview slide. I won't go through it because we all have kind of touched on things that we do, but I just want to point out that I'll be talking a little bit more about the exemplary communities, because that is where our old forest falls in. So when we map and track rare plants and rare natural communities and exemplary communities, the exemplary ones, the reference quality ones, are the ones I'm specifically talking about. So here's one of the questions that was posed to us. What is Maine's definition of old growth or old forest? Short answer, none. No formal definition. And so I'll be just saying old forest. You can think of that as late successional, LSOG, The OG, although I don't like saying the OG because I've been told that means the original gangsta, and I don't think that is very clear. It's, the kids. What's the median age here? We know what that means, right? Okay, so, but that's how I write it, is OG. But within the program, what we do is we're going out and we're mapping reference condition forests when they are common types across the landscape. And so we're mapping them to the extent that that element or that forest exists on landscape, so at the natural community scale. And then we'll use that information as part of our outreach and sharing information for conservation and management planning to landowners. So those that are using or are like the industrial landowners that are following management standards for FSC or SFI, they're incorporating that information. The Bureau of Parks and Lands in Maine also has an integrated resource policy, which specifically calls out special management areas for primary or old growth forests, which is anything over 150 years. So there's like the vagary of the definition again. So that's where it goes. Just a quick setting of the stage here. We don't know exactly how much we have of LSOG or old growth, old forest, but FIA plot data estimates about 1% of the forest area in Maine is over 150 years old, so that's not much. If any of you saw the Our Climate Common presentation earlier, their modeling, which was done for just about half the state, suggests about 4% of the state is in coverage over 150 years old. For our part, since we're the biologists on the ground, we've gone out and actually documented about 50,000 acres, which is just a fraction of those numbers there. We know that we don't have all of it, but that's across 215 known occurrences across the state, so 215 locations where we've inventoried and tracked old forest. Some of our data came from decades ago, from what was the Critical Areas program, documenting about 80 or so old growth occurrences. That was their term. All that information has moved to our program, and we now track or maintain information on about half of those as element occurrences. The others were either didn't fit the definition or were harvested. So how do we find and measure? The finding is kind of the fun part. A lot of it is desktop analysis. We've got some forest change data. You can see the red and yellow is intensive forest harvesting data going back to the late 1980s. So you can see a lot of Maine has gone through intensive forest management. We also use LIDAR-based products for basal area measurements. We've got the new NASA data for biomass. We've got Our Climate Common information, LIDAR-based. Occasionally foresters or other ecologists will give us leads on sites, and we'll get right out to them with landowner permission. We also have extensive information from Maine's ecological reserves. There's 90,000 acres of ecological reserves in the state, and many of these they were designed to capture high quality forests, so a lot of our old forests are within ecological reserves, and the ERs were designed for long-term monitoring. So we've got up to 30 years in some cases of data from these ecological reserves, measuring what you would expect: stand age, tree size, epiphyte indicators, etc. Just a quick glimpse. Here's stand age. I'm not even sure you can see those numbers, but these are all of our ecological reserves, and the older ones are ones that we've already got that we map and track as old forest. That's where the significant overlap is. Again, just reiterating the indicators, which others have already alluded to. But I think one thing that we haven't mentioned is we've got the on-the-ground measurements, but we also take into consideration the size of the stand and the landscape context that it's within. If it's a tiny area like the one you were referring to, and I can't remember what town that was surrounded by development, that landscape context does actually ding it in terms of its score. If it was in a much more natural context, even one that's been managed, it gets a little bit higher in our scoring, and all of that information rolls up to say whether it's an excellent or a good quality example. Here's just some fine measurements we do. We can talk about at some point where we do late successional index measurements, a protocol developed by Manomet, and then also some coarse woody debris specific measurements. So how do we influence conservation and management? Well, we hope we do. I'll say that. All of our information gets shared back with the landowners and is shared with land managers as well. And so our ecological reserves are a tremendous data source for being able to compare as a baseline how other lands are managed, or if you come across something else, how it might compare or contrast. We also do desktop-based pre-acquisition reviews, whether it's a 78,000 acre parcel or a 600 acre parcel. We'll look at it and review it with all of our tools to see if there's potential there. And then often we'll end up where we think there's a good potential for old forest or rare features. We'll request permission to go out, and we'll actually go out and survey these places and provide that to the landowner or the land trust or whoever is applying for grant funding, so that they can include that into their grant proposal and make it splash. And then finally, about 10 million acres of Maine's lands are in some kind of certification program, either FSC or SFI. So that turns out to be a great opportunity to share the information on where their unique and underrepresented successional stages may be. And we'll provide comments and guidance for what we would recommend for within the core of that feature, which might include no timber harvest and also buffers to that feature. So there's just a quick summary, but I think you got the point. That's it.